June 19th, 1944. 25,000 feet above a flat, glittering stretch of the Philippine Sea, 30 nautical miles east of Saipan. The sky smelled of hot oil and salt, and the sun struck rivet heads like tiny alarms. Lieutenant Kenta Mori felt the vibration through his boots as if the world itself were breathing. The nose of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero thrummed under his thighs, light and obedient, a blade of canvas and aluminum that had already made him feel invincible on 100 dawn patrols over the Solomons. He watched the blue below and thought of home, the paper lanterns at his parents' house, the narrow street leading to the flight school where he learned to trim the Zero with a fingertip. Ahead, the formation was a scatter of black crosses and bright sunlight. American carriers 100 miles away, their decks crowded with Hellcats and Corsairs. Mori's wingman, Petty Officer First Class Takashi Endo, flicked his stick and gave a quick thumbs up through the canopy's reflection. Over the radio there was the thin, composed voice of their flight leader, low, precise Japanese, counting Sanshi, Sango, Sankyu. They climbed. At first it was the familiar choreography of interception, slick silhouettes, wingmen tacked like birds, the thin metallic clack of guns being checked. Then the sky erupted into motion. Below them and off to starboard, American fighters peeled away from a carrier task group in tight spirals, their wings flashing and their engines wrenching into a higher note. The first contact was not a storm of tracer, but a sudden, clinical display of speed. An F-6F Hellcat slashed through a column of Zeros like a shearing sword, and in the cockpit of the nearest Zero, the image seared itself into Mori's sight. A broad-chested fighter, barrel-chested engine cowling, canopy low and square, twin rows of 50 caliber muzzles spitting orange. In the next instant, the textbook of air combat unraveled. Mori dove to close the range. His Zero responded with the nimbleness he'd trusted since flight school, banked on a wingtip, and the tail came around with a fox-like grace. The American pilot did not go into the expected turn fight. He punched the throttle, and the Hellcat flew past Mori like an iron ghost, its speed shredding the Zero's angle. Mori's guns, tuned for the old dogfights of boom and zoom tactics, snapped off a spray of 7.7 millimeter lead that thudded harmlessly into the Hellcat's thick skin. The Hellcat's return volley struck Endo's engine housing, a piston scream, a plume of vapor, then fire blooming against the blue. Mori felt his stomach lurch that instant, not from the engine's pitch, but from a new, unnameable recognition. The Hellcat shrugged off hits that would have punctured the propeller hub on a Zero. The American had armor where his plane had none, self-sealing tanks that did not turn his fuel into a torch, and enough horsepower to change the geometry of combat. It was faster in a diving, run and faster to accelerate back to fighting speed after a burst. The instruments on the Zero's dash, the altimeter, the tachometer, were suddenly less a map and more a countdown. Across the sky, another shape bullied through the formation. The Corsair's gull-wing silhouette, its long nose and bent wings making it look almost predatory. Pilots in the Japanese formation called it, softly, as if saying the name might summon it, the bent-wing demon. Lieutenant Mori watched one Corsair climb under him, then peel over in a high-velocity half-loop. Its armament was heavier, its 650s threw out showers of tracer that chewed into fabric and frame. When a Corsair's bullets began to chew at the tailplane of a Zero 2 ships over, the doomed pilot yanked his stick and the sky turned red as he tumbled earthward. The old rules, turn, outmaneuver, bleed the enemy with your lighter weight and superior low-speed handling, were still there in the manual, in the muscle memory of every Japanese pilot who had learned to dance the Zero. But in that thin, furious hour, the manual was no longer the whole answer. The Americans had engineered a different kind of fight. They accepted a heavier, less graceful machine in exchange for speed, armor, and concentrated firepower. They fought with numbers and with fighters that could shrug off the petty wounds that had once ended a Zero's life. In the cockpit next to Mori, a young pilot, Lieutenant, junior grade, Hiroshi Sato, fought to keep his plane level as a Hellcat hammered his left wing. Sato was a new pilot, 3 months out of training, eyes wide behind his goggles. He called the name of his captain, not in prayer but in a practical litany of coordinates and fallbacks. His engine coughed. He had never felt a Zero strip so readily of its composure. Outside, the sky filled with the odor of ozone and the sharp metallic tang of burnt feet as landing gear doors and flaps folded and tore free. Back on the American side, the pilot spoke in clipped radio calls that had nothing of the thin poetry of the Japanese transmissions. They had been briefed. Maintain altitude, use your speed, stay in pairs, and above all, never let the Zero get on your 6. The Hellcats had been designed with war-winning robustness in mind. Heavy Pratt & Whitney engines, thick wings that could take punishment and keep flying, and instrument panels that survived splintered cannons. In practice, that meant the Hellcat pilot could take a hit in the radiator or fuel line and still bring his bird home. The Corsair, with its raw speed and punch, forced Japanese formations to break rather than trade their lives for a single score. Mori checked his mirrors. Smoke stained the horizon where a Corsair had just torn through a formation and a Zero fell off like a moth, pieces shedding in a small, terrible cloud. He felt something loosen inside him. Not fear alone, but a widening loop of calculation, memories of earlier combats. The night raids over Guadalcanal, the slender victories when a Zero's lightness let them slip past heavier Allied fighters, now felt like relics in a museum, admired, instructive, impotent under the new rules of the air. As the battle opened wider, carrier decks far below responded with furious choreography. Catapults, catwalks, men shouting on the steel grass of flight decks, smoke trailing from strafed aircraft. Anti-aircraft tracers stitched the sky with a lattice of orange lace. Aircraft losses mounted on both sides, but the balance was shifting with an insidious clarity. Japanese pilots were dying in the dozens. The Americans had numbers, resources, and fighters whose design philosophy wrote a different margin for survival. Mori found himself thinking of the men on the carriers, young crewmen on each side doing the same work, hands burned by grease, eyes set under brims, knowing nothing of strategy except the one that kept them alive for another minute. He thought of the Zero's thin skin, of the way it had once been an extension of his body, forgiving and immediate. Up here it felt suddenly fragile, like old paper against a knife. Then, higher than the roar of engines, came a sound that made him look up. The crack of a structural failure, a distant, hollow snap. A Zero 2 miles off split its fuselage like a snapped reed and went into a long, clean spiral. The pilot did not radio. The sea took him. Mori tightened his grip on the stick and, for the first time in his career, altered his tactics not because his manual told him, but because his body had decided. He would not turn to trade energy anymore. He would avoid the burst points, use clouds as cover, and above all, keep his speed from bleeding away. It was a small private revolution in the cockpit, an admission that the age of the Invincible Zero might be coming to an end. Below, on a carrier not yet in visual range, Lieutenant Commander James Jim Aldridge, call sign Blue 3, trimmed his Hellcat with a surgeon's calm. He had trained his gunnery, flown mock fights over the dark ocean, and been told that this aircraft was his advantage. He watched a tracer arch and found the Japanese plane in the sights. For Aldridge, the morning was a job, precise and brutal. For Mori, it was the moment of realization. 2 pilots, 2 doctrines, the same sky, and the beginning of a lesson neither side would forget. 2 years earlier, the idea that any pilot flying a Zero could feel fear in the sky would have seemed absurd. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Mitsubishi A6M Zero ruled the Pacific like a hawk among pigeons. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, from Pearl Harbor to Darwin, it was the most feared aircraft in the world, faster, lighter, and more agile than anything the Allies could put in the air. The first American and British pilots who met the Zero didn't just lose. They were outclassed. Its range was unheard of, its climb rate astonishing, and in a dogfight, its pilots could twist, climb, and roll in ways no other plane could follow. Reports filtering back to Allied command were so incredulous that intelligence officers thought they were exaggerated. Some even doubted the Zero existed at all. It began, as so many revolutions in war do, with an underestimation. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated ace, banked his Zero in the golden haze above the Coral Sea. His gloves were thin, the better to feel the pulse of the control stick, and his aircraft responded like an extension of his will. Ahead, a formation of American wildcats crawled through the sunlight, heavy and stiff-winged like iron insects. Sakai's squadron descended in a slow, predatory dive. Within moments, his wing guns flashed. 20mm cannon shells lanced through the first wildcat's fuselage, and the enemy broke apart in a puff of smoke and spiraling fragments. The rest scattered. He smiled faintly behind his goggles. That battle would become a pattern repeated across the Pacific. Zeros tearing through Allied formations, diving, rolling, and climbing with a grace that seemed impossible. To Allied pilots used to aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk or Brewster Buffalo, the Zero was an alien predator. It could turn inside their loops, climb twice as fast, and stay aloft for hours longer. The Americans quickly learned to fear the ghostly white planes that appeared out of the sun. "They come like hornets," one pilot wrote, "and they never miss." The Zero's secret was its philosophy. Japanese engineers had pursued extreme lightness at all costs. Every rivet, every sheet of aluminum was pared down to the absolute minimum. Armor was almost non-existent. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks, no thick bulletproof glass, no heavy redundant systems. The result? A plane so nimble it could dance in air currents where other fighters stalled. The Zero could outturn anything the Allies had by at least 20%, a staggering margin in aerial combat. Its 20mm Type 99 cannons could tear through a bomber in seconds. But that same lightness came with a hidden cost: fragility. If a single 50-caliber round hit a Zero's fuel tank, it could ignite instantly. The pilots knew this. They joked grimly that if their engine caught fire, their cockpit became an oven in seconds. But for 2 years, no one could challenge them long enough for that flaw to matter. From Rabaul to the Dutch East Indies, Zeros ruled. They escorted bombers, hunted reconnaissance flights, and shredded Allied air groups before they even reached their targets. The myth of invincibility grew with every victory. In the first 6 months of the war, the Zero achieved an almost unbelievable kill ratio, nearly 12-to-1 in favor of Japanese pilots. Allied aircraft were outdated, underpowered, and poorly matched. Pilots who survived their first engagements came back to base with stories that sounded like nightmares. Planes that turned on a dime, guns that appeared from nowhere, and opponents who seemed to float through the sky like smoke. American engineers were stunned. They didn't even have a captured Zero to study. Until one crashed almost intact on a Kutan island in June 1942, they didn't fully understand what they were up against. When U.S. intelligence teams examined that captured aircraft, their reports came back with an uneasy mix of admiration and relief. Admiration for its design, a masterpiece of aerodynamic efficiency. And relief because, for all its brilliance, it had limits. "It's a knife fight," one test pilot said after flying it. "But if you don't play the knife game, you can win." That simple insight, that the Zero could only dominate in turning dog fights, became the seed of the Allied comeback. By late 1942, new Allied aircraft began to enter the Pacific theater. The F-4F Wildcat pilots, learning from hard experience, developed the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver that used teamwork rather than agility to counter the Zero's turn radius. Instead of trying to out-twist the Japanese pilots, they covered each other, forcing the enemy into their line of fire. It wasn't a perfect solution. It was desperate, even clumsy at times. But it showed a change in mindset. Allied pilots were adapting, and in the hangars back home, designers were drawing something entirely new, fighters that would no longer play the Zero's game. Where the Japanese built for lightness, the Americans built for power. In factories across the U.S., massive Pratt & Whitney engines were bolted onto prototypes with names that would soon become legend. The F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, and the P-38 Lightning. Each one heavier, faster, and deadlier than the last. The Allies were preparing to meet the Zero not on its terms, but on theirs. By early 1944, Japanese pilots noticed a shift in the air. Combat reports grew strange. Enemy fighters were climbing higher, hitting harder, surviving longer. The kill ratios were reversing. And on a humid morning over the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Kenta Mori, who once watched the Zero dance untouched through the sky, would find himself face to face with those new machines. The same machines that would end the myth of Japanese air superiority. The same day that would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the day Japan's pilots finally realized the Zero was no longer invincible. June 1944, the Pacific had become a chessboard of carriers, convoys, and smoke columns. The Japanese Navy still believed its air wings could blunt the American advance, that discipline, courage, and the legacy of the Zero could compensate for whatever the Americans were building in their factories. But that belief was about to collide with cold reality. Above the Philippine Sea, the new generation of Allied aircraft had arrived. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Volt F-4U Corsair were unlike anything the Japanese had faced before. Both were massive, brute machines with engines so powerful they sounded less like aircraft and more like thunder rolling across the ocean. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine delivered nearly 2,000 horsepower, more than twice that of the early Zeros. The Corsair, with its long nose and signature gull wings, could reach speeds over 400 miles per hour, almost unthinkable in 1941. In a straight fight, the Zero no longer dictated the dance. Lieutenant Commander Jim Aldridge leaned over a map under the glow of a red cabin light. He'd flown Wildcats early in the war. He knew what it was to watch a Zero loop around you like a ghost. Now, as he traced lines of expected enemy flight paths, he could feel a quiet confidence among his pilots. "This isn't 42 anymore," he told them. "You're flying Hellcats. You hit them fast, you hit them high, and you don't turn with them, ever. Dive, shoot, climb, reset. We control the engagement." The men nodded, the room humming with the low tension of routine readiness. No one said it aloud, but they all knew this was the battle they'd been training for. At the same hour, hundreds of miles west, Lieutenant Mori and the surviving pilots from the 601st Air Group lifted off from Guam. Their Zeros were immaculate, but already relics, designs conceived in a different era when air supremacy meant maneuver, not armor. "Enemy detected, bearing east," came the report through Mori's headset. He looked down at the rising sea glint and saw what at first seemed like nothing more than moving dots. Then they grew, filling his canopy with blue-painted wings and white stars. Hellcats in disciplined formations, climbing like a wall of steel. The Japanese pilots climbed to meet them, and for the first time, the fight went wrong before it even began. The first wave met at 20,000 feet. A Corsair pilot named Lieutenant Robert Hawk Danner spotted the rising Zeros through his canopy and called over the radio, Tally-ho, Angels 20. The Corsair's nose dropped, its massive engine roared, and gravity became an ally. Danner's 650 caliber guns erupted, bright tracers streaking into the oncoming formation. The Zeros scattered, instinctively braking into hard turns, a maneuver that once guaranteed escape. But the Americans didn't follow the turn. They climbed instead, looped above, and dove again with crushing momentum. The fight no longer resembled the elegant spirals of 1942. It was violence delivered from altitude and speed. Maury rolled into a counter-climb, his engine straining, his canopy fogging. He managed to line up a fleeting shot on a Corsair's tail and squeezed the trigger. A few bursts, then nothing. His rounds bounced off the Corsair's thick skin. The American kept flying, undeterred. Seconds later, a Hellcat appeared from above, its wings glinting silver. Maury yanked his stick. Too late. Bullets tore through his fuselage, shredding the fabric panels, severing the control cables. His Zero shuddered, dropped, caught itself. The engine still ran, but his confidence didn't. The old belief that skill and spirit could overcome steel began to fracture. That day, June 19, 1944, would later be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese launched over 350 aircraft. The Americans shot down more than 250. The ratio was catastrophic, not because the Japanese fought poorly, but because they were fighting a war that had already outgrown their machines. Hellcats and Corsairs dove with reckless energy, their pilots guided by radar and coordinated by fleet command ships. American carriers had perfected launch timing, recovery operations, and vector control. The sky itself had become a system of synchronized destruction. By contrast, Japan's air groups lacked both radar coverage and veteran pilots. Many of their new recruits had barely 100 hours of flight time. The elite had been lost over Midway, the Solomons and Rabaul. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now being flown by boys barely out of flight school. Maury's Zero was riddled with holes, his fuel gauge spinning down. He broke away, diving into cloud cover. The sky below was filled with burning wrecks, tiny blossoms of flame dotting the sea. The radio was chaos, shouts, static, calls for home bearings that would never be answered. "Endo, Sato, report position," he called, but there was only silence. Through the clouds he saw it. A burning aircraft plunging toward the waves, its wingtip aflame, its pilot still inside. The falling plane carried the red circle of Japan. Maury's throat closed. He dove lower, his canopy streaked with smoke. Far below, the American carriers gleamed, perfect, orderly, unshaken. At that moment, the Zero's magic was gone. Its myth had been rewritten in fire and salt. By nightfall, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost nearly all of its frontline carrier air power. The carriers Shokaku and Hio burned into the sea. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots were gone. The Americans lost 29 planes. For the men who survived, like Maury, the realization came quietly, cruelly. The Zero was no longer the sword of Japan. It was a memory of a different war. The balance of the Pacific had shifted forever, and the sky that once belonged to the rising sun now belonged to the storm. Night fell over the Philippine Sea like a curtain. The smoke trails were gone, replaced by drifting oil slicks and the glow of distant fires on the horizon. Lieutenant Kenta Mori's Zero limped back toward Guam, its engine coughing and the instrument panel flickering. The cockpit reeked of gasoline and cordite. Every vibration felt like the aircraft's last. The sky had grown strangely quiet. No more radio chatter, no squadron call signs, no rhythmic breathing of formation flight. Just the hum of a single wounded engine and the distant, rhythmic thump of American carrier artillery, echoing below the clouds. When Maury finally landed at Orote Airfield, the base looked hollow. Mechanics waited without words. Fuel drums were half empty, spare parts non-existent. The once proud hangars that had turned out flawless Zeros were now little more than skeletons filled with smoke and grit. A senior officer approached him, clipboard in hand. "How many?" he asked. Maury took off his helmet. His face was gray with exhaustion. "None returned," he said quietly. The officer didn't write it down. There was no need. Everyone on the island already knew. In the polished halls of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, officers studied reports with the same stunned disbelief that had once met early Allied defeats. Losses were not in the dozens, but in the hundreds. Carrier air groups, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had ceased to exist as cohesive fighting units. The Zero had been outclassed. The pilots had been outtrained. And the Empire's industrial base, already straining under Allied bombing, could not build replacements fast enough. But pride, more than logistics, held command together. Senior officers refused to abandon the Zero. It was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of national identity, of the martial spirit of Japan. To admit it was obsolete was to admit something larger, that Japan's strategy, its doctrine, its faith in spirit over steel, was failing. In factories at Nagoya and Yokosuka, engineers tried to breathe new life into the dying legend. They stripped down Zeros for lighter frames, fitted them with slightly more powerful engines, experimented with armor plating that wouldn't unbalance the aircraft. New versions appeared, the A6M5, the A6M7, faster, heavier, and with self-sealing tanks. But every improvement took away the very thing that had made the Zero special. Its agility. With armor, it no longer danced. With more fuel, it no longer climbed like a ghost. It became a compromise, a relic chasing the ghosts of its own past glory. Meanwhile, in the skies above the Philippines and the Marianas, Hellcats and Corsairs patrolled unchallenged. Their pilots were veterans of dozens of sorties, trained in high-altitude interception and radar-guided vectoring. The Zero, once the teacher, was now the student, and the lessons were brutal. Japan's surviving aces watched the transformation with bitter clarity. Saburo Sakai, still alive but wounded from earlier combat, wrote later that flying in 1944 felt like entering a slaughterhouse. He described the shock of watching his squadron, veterans, men who had once won impossible victories, torn apart by Hellcats before even sighting the enemy fleet. He called the new American fighters the walls of death. For pilots like Mori, who had once idolized men like Sakai, the psychological toll was immense. Each mission began with ritual bows and ended, if at all, with funerals. The Imperial Navy tried to sustain morale with speeches and slogans. 1-0 equals 5 Hellcats, they proclaimed. But everyone in the air knew it was a lie. As American bombing intensified, Japan's industrial heart began to collapse. Aluminum supplies dwindled. Replacement engines became scarce. Training programs were shortened to just a few weeks. Mori watched as boys, barely out of school, faces still soft, hands trembling on their control sticks, joined his squadron. They called him Senpai, teacher. He taught them how to check the engine primer, how to watch for vapor trails, how to cut throttle in a dive to prevent overspeeding. He taught them everything he could. But he also knew what none of them could say aloud, that he was teaching them how to die. By the end of 1944, Japan's airfields were filled with Zeros that could barely take off, flown by pilots who would never see their second mission. The myth of invincibility had died in the clouds over Saipan, but on the ground, Japan refused to bury it. When reports of catastrophic losses reached Tokyo, a new doctrine was proposed, one that horrified some and inspired others. If the Zero could no longer win in combat, perhaps it could win in sacrifice. The concept of Tokutai, the special attack units, was born. The same planes that had once been symbols of finesse and mastery would now become weapons of desperation. Young pilots, barely trained, would fly their Zeros directly into American ships. The logic was cold. A pilot's life was expendable, but a ship sunk by a suicide dive was a measurable victory. For the men who once believed they ruled the skies, it was an unbearable reversal. Lieutenant Maury sat in silence the first time he heard the order read aloud. Around him, the airfield was quiet. The engineers who once tuned engines for precision now bolted on 250-kilogram bombs beneath the wings. The Zero, once the elegant sword of the Empire, had become its sacrificial blade. That night, as the ocean wind moved across the runway, Maury walked past rows of aircraft lit by lantern light. Mechanics worked quietly, their faces expressionless. Each Zero looked identical, yet every one was marked for death. Maury paused beside his own aircraft, running a gloved hand along the fuselage. The paint was chipped, the once glossy Hinomaru faded by salt. He thought of the early days, the triumphs, the dances above the coral sea, the invincibility. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Even the finest sword dulls when it's swung too long." In the distance, American Corsairs roared over the dark sea on night patrol, the new kings of the sky, engines echoing like judgment. The age of the Zero was ending, but its shadow would take one final, terrible form. Leyte Gulf, October 25, 1944. Dawn came in crimson streaks over the Leyte Gulf, the sea still churning from the previous day's bombardments. The air smelled of salt and burning oil, of cordate and fuel. On a narrow strip of tarmac in Luzon, Lieutenant Kenta Mori stood beside his Zero, now armed with a single 250-kilogram bomb strapped under its belly. The plane looked heavier than it ever had before. It was no longer a fighter. It was a missile with wings. His commander approached quietly, clipboard in hand. "Mori-san," he said, "today we strike the enemy carriers near Samar. You will lead the first wave of the Shikishima unit." Mori saluted. He didn't speak. Behind him, 19 other pilots stood in formation, most barely old enough to shave. Their headbands bore the rising sun, their eyes flickered between pride and terror. Mechanics bowed as they passed, as though in a funeral procession. The field priest murmured sutras over each cockpit. When the engines began to roar to life, the ground shook. The Zero's familiar vibration returned through the seat, but it no longer hummed like an eager blade. It trembled, burdened by its final purpose. Japan's air doctrine had changed irrevocably. The once proud fighter corps of the Imperial Navy, masters of aerobatics and disciplined formation, had been replaced by kamikaze squadrons born of desperation. The decision came from the highest command. If Japan could not outproduce the Americans, it would out-sacrifice them. On paper, it was a cold equation. A Zero carrying a bomb could sink a destroyer or even cripple a carrier. In practice, it was the weaponization of tragedy. Each pilot's final flight was filmed for propaganda reels. Photographers captured their smiles, their bows, their letters home. But behind the ceremony was a growing silence, a silence that swallowed everything that had once made these men aviators. Maury could feel it even before takeoff. This wasn't about air combat anymore. It was about atonement. At 06:43, Maury's Zero rolled down the strip. The bomb rattled beneath him. The tail lifted, the wings caught the humid air, and the plane clawed upward into the orange dawn. One by one, the others followed. From above, the formation looked like a flock of cranes. Elegant, pure, deliberate. But each carried death. As he climbed through 10,000 feet, Maury looked over his shoulder and saw the rising sun reflected in the canopies behind him. The world below was a mosaic of rice paddies, smoke, and coastline. He thought of his family in Nagasaki, his mother's garden, his father's watch, the street lanterns in spring, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether honor meant obedience or truth. Radar aboard the USS St. Lo picked them up first, 20 incoming bogies at low altitude. The deck erupted into motion. Gunners manned their stations, anti-aircraft batteries began to spin, and Corsairs were scrambled from nearby carriers to intercept. Lieutenant Robert Hawk Danner, the same Corsair pilot who had fought Maury months earlier, was among them. He had no idea his opponent was up there again, flying not to fight, but to die. The Zeros came in low, their engines screaming. American tracers stitched the sky, cutting through wings and fuselages. Several planes exploded mid-air, their bombs detonating in brief, searing flashes. But a few broke through. Maury's Zero was among them. The sea below was a shifting mirror of flak bursts and fireballs. The St. Lo loomed ahead, grey, defiant, alive with movement. Gunners tracked him, their barrels flashing white heat. Maury's left wing was hit. Fragments of metal sliced into his arm, but he held the stick steady. He could see the carrier's deck crew now. Tiny silhouettes running, shouting. He imagined, absurdly, that one of them might be Danner. The alarm bells in his cockpit screamed. His gauges spun wildly. The bomb release switch was armed. He thought again of his training days, of turning inside Wildcats, of blue sky and freedom, of the first time he had felt the Zero lift beneath him like a living thing. It wasn't supposed to end like this. The nose of the aircraft dipped slightly. The horizon tilted. Through the smoke and the tracer fire, Maury closed his eyes. He whispered, "Forgive me." Then the sea and sky became one. At 10:53 a.m., Maury's Zero struck the deck of the St. Lo, just aft of the island's superstructure. The bomb detonated deep within the ship's hangar deck, igniting stored ordnance. Within minutes, the carrier was engulfed in fire. At 11:25, it sank, the first major warship ever sunk by a kamikaze attack. The Americans were stunned. It wasn't the power of the weapon that haunted them. It was the resolve behind it. For Japan, it was hailed as a moment of pride. Newspapers in Tokyo called it a divine victory. The Shikishima unit was immortalized as heroes. But among the surviving pilots, the mood was darker. Maury's empty bunk remained untouched. His personal effects, flight log, family photo, a folded letter never sent, were placed in a box and sent home. The photograph of him standing beside his Zero would appear in a wartime pamphlet with the caption, "He died smiling for the Emperor." Yet those who had known him remembered something else. The silence before takeoff, the way his eyes lingered on the horizon. He hadn't smiled. He had looked tired. The Zero's legend had ended not in triumph, but in sacrifice. What had begun as the purest symbol of Japan's aerial supremacy had become the vessel of its surrender to inevitability. And though thousands more kamikazes would follow, each flight carried less of the old faith and more of the quiet sorrow of men who knew the truth. They were dying not for victory, but because there was nothing left to win. The Zero would continue to appear in combat for another year, but never again as a weapon of dominance. The pilots who flew it now carried history itself on their wings, the burden of a once invincible machine made mortal by the march of time and industry. And for those who survived to see the war's end, every whisper of the sea, every hum of an engine was a reminder the sky had changed forever. August 1945, Japan lay in ruins. Cities once filled with lanterns and song were now ash and smoke. The Zero, once a proud emblem of the empire's might, sat rusting in hangars, wings torn, engines stripped for parts, paint faded by salt and sun. When Emperor Hirohito's voice came over the radio, his words, spoken softly, almost brokenly, marked the end of it all. The soldiers, the pilots, the factories, the entire nation stood still. For those who had flown the Zero, it was more than surrender. It was the death of an ideal. Many surviving pilots walked out onto airfields and placed their hands on the fuselages of grounded Zeros one last time. Some wept. Some saluted. Others stood silently, listening to the wind whistle through the empty gun ports. Lieutenant Robert Dana, now stationed aboard a carrier anchored near Japan, watched as Japanese mechanics dismantled their planes under Allied supervision. He recognized the aircraft instantly. The curved wingtips, the elegant spinner, the rising sun insignia now partially painted over. Even in defeat, it looked beautiful. After the surrender, American engineers studied captured Zeros closely. They were astonished, not by brute power, but by precision. The aircraft's control harmony, responsiveness, and aerodynamic balance were decades ahead of their time. In test flights, U.S. pilots described it as flying on thought. It was light, almost fragile, built for grace, not durability. And that was its strength and its curse. Against slower, heavier aircraft, it had been unbeatable. But in the brutal arms race of 1943 onward, as metal met machine in factories across Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles, the Zero's brilliance became its own undoing. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no forgiveness. When it first took flight, it ruled the skies. By the end, it was a ghost chasing the future. Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero's designer, survived the war. He never built another fighter again. In later years, he would write quietly about the conflict, about his belief that the dream of flight was meant for peace, not death. He watched as Japan transformed, from a nation of war to one of industry and innovation. The factories that once produced Zeros would, decades later, build cars, cameras, and electronics that connected the world instead of destroying it. But Horikoshi's eyes always lingered on the sky. He once said, "All I wanted was to make something beautiful." And he had. In the decades that followed, the Zero became a paradox. To some, it symbolized sacrifice and bravery. To others, it stood as a reminder of fanaticism and tragedy. At museums across Japan, restored Zeros sit under soft lights, polished, reverent, still. Tourists walk around them in silence. Veterans sometimes place flowers beneath the wings. Children gaze up, hearing only stories, not of war, but of men who once believed the sky could make them free. One museum in Chiran keeps hundreds of letters written by kamikaze pilots before their final flights. The ink is faded, the handwriting young. Some letters are to mothers, others to lovers, a few to no one in particular. They all end the same way. For the Empire, for Japan, farewell. But between the lines, you can feel it, doubt, longing, humanity. They were not monsters. They were men lost in a storm too vast to escape. In 1978, on a remote island in the Pacific, a rusted airframe was discovered in a jungle clearing. Its wings broken, its nose buried in soil. Moss crept along the fuselage, and vines had woven through the cockpit. It was a Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The serial number traced it to a squadron lost over Rabaul in 1943. Inside, archaeologists found a small notebook sealed in an oilcloth pouch. The pages were almost gone, but one sentence remained legible. "The sky is beautiful today. I hope my wings carry me home." They never did. But the words survived, fragile, fleeting, like the plane itself. The Zero story is not just one of war, but of contradiction, of genius and despair, pride and loss. It showed what human hands could create when driven by vision, and what humanity could destroy when blinded by purpose. It was the sword that flew, and like all swords, it was destined to break. When modern pilots watch one take off today, in rare air shows or restored museum flights, the sound of its engine still draws silence, not because it's feared, but because it's remembered. For a moment, the air carries the echo of 1940, the dawn of something that was once invincible. Then the sound fades, and the sky is quiet again. The Zero rests. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was more than a machine. It was Japan's dream of mastery in the air, a dream born in brilliance, consumed by war, and remembered in silence. Every rivet, every wing, every pilot who took to the sky in one carried the story of what happens when beauty meets tragedy. The Zero soared higher than any before it, but even the mightiest wings cannot escape the weight of history.